The full moon, its pale face, peered through the light winter clouds of the night sky. Snow lay in caps on the branches of firs and pines. In one house, the windows were cozily lit. Moonlight filtered in, dimly illuminating the interior. Things and people's clothes were scattered on the floor. In this place, people indulged in lovemaking. They were not afraid to voice and realize their secret desires. There were no words of love here, but there was everything for everyone, and complete freedom of choice and action. And smoke was billowing behind the screen. An uncontrollable sigh was heard from there. The gentleman was sitting in a relaxed pose. He smoked, smoothly inhaling the smoke and blowing clouds out of his nose. There was an ashtray nearby where the ruler shook the ashes. A young muscular man in an open robe sat with his legs tucked up on the floor with his eyes closed. Then, with a disappointed chuckle, he called Yoon-ha by name. The girl had her back to him. In the opinion of the gentleman, she was stubborn and therefore refused to speak. The beauty clenched her hand into a fist, holding back her emotions, and asked how it was possible to like looking at such a thing. But he reminded her that he was blind, and since his eyes could not see, he wanted to please his ears. The master gave her money for that very reason, to buy her voice. The young lady agreed that he was right, and that her vote had been bought and belonged to the master. But those people had not paid Yoon-ha, and so from now on she would not say another word. The girl said that if he was not going to listen only to her voice, then she would prefer to remain silent. The gentleman lunged forward to touch her chin with the end of the pipe, and asked if she would please him if she drove everything out of here. The young maiden winced as the receiver caught the string of her kimono. The man pulled on it, demanding an answer. Fear and confusion were reflected on Yoon-ha's face, and the interlocutor insisted on an answer as to whether she would entertain him. The girl bit her lip. A shudder ran through her body. Once she dared to think about it. The gentleman was outwardly cruel, but our heroine hoped that behind this there might be something similar to herself. The girl thought that this could be what connected them together with an invisible thread, and now our heroine was kneeling before him, her head bowed submissively, completely in his power, and she said that if the master so desired, then let him drive them away and touch her. The master was surprised by her answer, and she was afraid that she had made a mistake. After a pause, the man called Yul-jae and ordered the servant to gouge out those people's eyes and cut out their tongues. Regret, panic, and fear appeared in Yoon-ha's eyes. But she did not dare to do anything or object when everything was happening before her eyes. Tears rolled down the girl's eyes as blood splashed on her face. The gentleman asked her not to cry. He assured her that it would be like this until she paid in full for her escape. The gentleman assured Yoon-ha that he had no intention of killing her, and brought his face closer for a passionate kiss. 3 months ago there was snow, covering the mountains with a white blanket. Nature slept, shrouded in cold and frost. Voices were heard around the area calling for directions to the north. A large animal was trying to escape from its pursuers. The man said that everything had to be done properly. The other insisted that the creature was as big as a bear. The young man stumbled and ran across the room, banging on the cast-iron pot with a hammer as hard as he could. And to top it all off, he was urging the damn pig on with his voice, but at some point his foot slipped, and he fell on the snow. At that time an enraged wild animal was rushing towards him with inexorable speed. Man-bok's face was distorted with the horror of imminent death. His comrades could not help him at that moment, because they were far away, and there was no help to be expected from anywhere. But then a shot rang out. Blood from the boar's head splashed onto the young man's face. The carcass of a wild animal fell to the ground literally a few meters away. A gentle voice brought the boy out of his stupor, asking if he was okay. A young brunette stood before him with a gun in her hands, which was so out of harmony with her gentle nature. She assured him that just a little more and something irreparable could have happened. The beater tried to say something, stuttering, but all that came out was incoherent muttering and isolated sounds. Soon, having mastered himself, he was able to utter words of gratitude. But then the girl was called by name. The brunette in the blue kimono asked Yoon-ha if she was hurt. He put his arm around her shoulders and led her away, only looking back once at the scared-to-death young beater. He said that they should have gone back as soon as they were done. The girl assured him that she was going to stop at a bookstore on the way to get some books and pay her debts. The interlocutor smiled and agreed. After all, he himself should have stopped by Buen to see his mother. Meanwhile, the comrades surrounded the beater and asked if Man-bok was okay. The young man asked his brother who the handsome man was. He assured him that the young gentleman was from the Panzo house, but he was interested in the shorter man next to him. The relative was surprised that Manbok did not know Yun-ha. He chanted the name of the amazing girl, and suddenly I remembered the conversations about the younger sister, Kizin-yeon, who was the best in Bwangwon. It was a clear sunny day. The warmth had eaten away the snow cover in some places, and even living plants were visible. A group of girls were heading somewhere in pursuit of common interests. A question was heard through the wall in an indignant tone. The girl asked the lady what she meant. Her hair was in a bun. The older lady smoked. She said in a businesslike manner that there was nothing surprising, and she believed that they could no longer take care of her as before. The lady believed that young Yun-ha should experience what the life of a gisang was like. The girl asked her to clarify what she meant, and she couldn't believe that Yun-ha was going to be included in the kijok. Sitting on her knees before the lady, she insisted that Yun-ha should not become a gisang. But the older lady could not understand why this was so. She claimed that every day there was a whole line of men who dreamed of taking possession of her. The headmistress believed that such beauty should not be wasted, and the sister felt like many hands were reaching out to the young Yun-ha. She tried to object to the lady, but she angrily asked in response what the younger sister of the interlocutor was doing now. The girl had been fed, clothed and brought up since she was a child. Now she walked freely with men and hunted with them equally. The lady thought that Yun-ha was so ungrateful that she got involved with the young master and spent time with him. The teacher was sure that he had a passionate desire to taste the forbidden fruit in his thoughts when he was near young Yun-ha, and gently touched her. She reminded him that young Master Yun was not only the son of the great General Yun Panso, but also her flesh and blood. And she did not want to endure as a mother talk about how he was only fit for less. The respected woman because he was the son of a kisaing. And did she know the reason why she herself tried to stay away from the young master? The girl assured him that she regretted that she had not been able to prevent this earlier, and she insisted that such a thing would not happen again. Before she finished speaking, she burst into a coughing fit. The lady noticed that the girl was ill every time the Ipdon began. She knocked out the ashes during her charge's next coughing fit. The girl assured that she would make sure that her sister never again got involved with the young master. She thought that she could handle the role better than Yun-ha, and asked to forget about this misunderstanding. The lady noted that in such a state she would not even be able to receive guests today, but still talks about protection. With her eyes downcast, the girl assured that she would do whatever she was told. But in return, she begged them to stop talking about Yun-ha being added to the gisang list. The teacher told Belgum that Lord Cho-yeon-ho wanted her as a concubine, but the choice was with the girl herself. She could either agree to the offer and pay the ransom, or let her sister serve the men. But if her body, worth pennies, loses its value, then no matter what, Yun-ha will replace her sister. The sun rose from behind the mountains, illuminating the beginning of the day. Nature was filled with light and acquired bright colors of life. Yun-ha and the young master walked through the market past the stalls. The girl sincerely thanked him, because the medicine was expensive. The girl was carefully holding a certain linen bundle. The interlocutor noted that her sister was often ill at this time of year, and Yun-ha always took care of her. He asked to let her know if she needed anything else. The gentleman assured her that he could have given her a gold coin, but he was afraid that he would be refused again. The girl assured her that this was indeed enough. The young man asked if Yun-ha had had a hard time, and assured her that he regretted that she had to do hard work with such a fragile body. The young lady clutched the bundle and asked if he remembered the tiger hunt 5 days ago. That day, the sister noticed a scratch from a branch on Yun-ha's body and became very angry. Then Belgum said that her sister should not have been doing such dangerous work, and she said it with an unusually high intonation. It turned out that the drunkard had cut the girl by throwing a bottle at her. Yun-ha told the master that she would be lying if she said that her work was not hard, but she was still okay with it. After all, it was nothing compared to what her sister had to go through. The girl believed that if she put aside a penny or two, then in the future she could hope to live an ordinary life. That's why she asked the gentleman not to worry too much about her, and she was grateful that such an insignificant person as she was given the opportunity to do such things. After all, Yun-ha knew how to handle weapons, and also how to write and read in Western and Korean languages. And all this was thanks to the young master. The girl didn't notice how they had already reached the bookstore, and she asked the young gentleman if he would like to join her too. The young man assured her that he would wait here, but she could take her time. Yun-ha smiled slightly and promised that she would return soon. Having entered, the girl closed the door behind her and loudly informed Ajusi about her visit. Junha looked around. She grabbed a juicy and looked for him. At the same time, she put the bag she brought on the table. Soon, in response to her call, a man appeared from the next room. Holding books in his hands, he asked the guest what brought her today. The girl said that she wanted to pay off her debts, and seeing his gloomy face, she asked how he felt and whether he had accidentally fallen ill. The man didn't answer her question, but he handed her the books since Yunha had already dropped in on him. He said that there weren't many people in this place who knew this language, and Yunha was the only one who could read it, so she could keep these books for herself. Words of gratitude followed. The girl asked if there was a new job for her, but the answer was negative. Ajusi assured that he would inform as soon as something appeared. He asked with a laugh if the young master was waiting for Yunha outside, and advised the girl to hurry up because it was quite chilly outside. The girl asked again if Ajusi was sick, but he waved his hands in response, and assured that he was as healthy as ever. Soon Ajusi returned to the guest. The owner of the shop apologized for the commotion that had arisen, and asked to tell the name of the book he was looking for. Osoba with a cane asked if there was anyone here who spoke the language of the western region. Ajusi assured that there were only two. The guest touched the pouch that Yunha had recently left behind, and guessed out loud that one of the two was wearing a chako. The young shop guest assured that he wanted to find a professional Chongisu reader, since he himself was blind. Ajusi was confused and did not know how to react to this. The person with the cane asked if it was really so hard to believe his words, and asked in that case to come to an agreement with that girl, so that she would agree to become his Chongisu. Yunha looked confused and even scared. The book and medicine fell from her hands. The young lady tried to find out what was going on here. After all, her sister had to rest due to illness. The angry gentleman insulted Kisang-yeon. He was angry that the girl refused to undress. The man was going to kick her. But Yunha screamed and rushed to her sister's defense, taking the blow herself. The older sister reached out to the girl. The client did not understand what was happening. His face was distorted with anger and irritation. There was a shard of a clay jug lying on the floor. The man decided to take advantage of it. The angry visitor clutched a clay shard in his hand and swung it. He decided that since everyone had gone mad, they would all die together. Suddenly, someone grabbed his hand with the shard firmly by the wrist, holding it back from being struck. It was young Master Yun. He advised the angry visitor to be more careful. The stunned man recognized him and asked in surprise why he was there. The young man was holding the man's wrist tightly, holding the shard in his hand. The client was stuttering and begging him to stop. The irritated visitor justified his behavior by saying that the Kisang refused to follow his orders. The two female figures on the floor froze in fear. The young gentleman let go of the man's hand. He assumed that the client was drunk and had forgotten about the extra eyes around him. The pottery shard slipped out of the visitor's hand and fell to the floor. The establishment's employees peered through the open doors. Mr. Yun gave an order. The room must be prepared and the gentleman must be escorted there. The owner of the establishment apologized to the customer for not being able to properly educate the low-born children. She promised to serve him properly next time. The young gentleman stood at the open door of the premises. He addressed the owner of the establishment. The beautiful woman was his mother. The high Kisang lowered her eyes. She asked the young master to stay for a while. Then her gaze fell on the two girls who had been sitting on the floor all this time. The hostess began to blame Yong for what had happened. Both girls just trembled silently. The elder looked up at her sister. Both had tears streaming down their cheeks. She wished that everything that had happened was just a nightmare. There was snow on the roofs of the houses. A slender figure in boyish clothes appeared in the doorway of the bookstore. Just thinking about yesterday's events made Yunha's heart ache. She sighed heavily and drifted off into memories. The young lady came to her sister and tried to persuade her to explain everything properly. It was not clear what Yan had done for her, and what the lady had in mind. The older sister said that the girl didn't need to know anything. Yunha was surprised that her sister still thought of her as an unreasonable child. She couldn't pretend when she saw everything with her own eyes. The sister didn't even want to turn around. Bitter tears streamed down Kisang-yeon's face. The two young ladies were kneeling on the floor. The older one asked Yunha for forgiveness. She was very sorry. The girl clenched her fists. She realized that if her sister hadn't become a Kisang because of her, she wouldn't have suffered so much. Li Yan was the most coveted flower of Buyongwon. Her beauty was sung. Her portraits were painted. She was admired. But she lost her parents at a young age, and was left penniless. Moreover, she had a younger sister to take care of. Therefore, the girl was ready for anything at that time. Yeon got food and fed her little sister. They often slept right on the floor, until someone accidentally noticed them. The girl's huge eyes were full of tears. Her sister's head rested on her shoulder. The richly dressed lady turned her attention to the orphan. She asked her name. 10 years had passed since then, and all the time Yeon was a gisayang. She was not considered a human being. In addition, girls who had reached adulthood were treated like dirt. After all, there was a demand for younger ones. Therefore, before the next winter comes, it is necessary to pay the ransom and cross out Yeon's name from the kijok. And the only wish of the young lady was for her older sister to lead the life of an ordinary woman. From that moment on, Yoon-ha gathered her courage and began to act. And it didn't matter whether it was a hunt or a random assignment. The main thing was that her work brought in money. The girl turned to the owner of the bookstore for help. She asked Jusi-song to give her at least some work. The young lady confessed that lately Hansu had been particularly cruel to her older sister. The man thought about it. He looked at Yoon-ha and decided to ask her something. The girl froze and did not take her intense gaze off the shop owner. The man told her everything, and then asked if the girl objected to something like that. The rays of the setting sun colored the sky. Everything around was shrouded in silence and calm. Suddenly, this silence was broken by a loud creak. The door opened and a man appeared on the threshold. Yoon-ha froze in fear. The stranger invited her in. The young lady nervously swallowed the lump in her throat. The girl followed her guide. He explained that a noble gentleman needed a man who could read the language of the western region. The man said that he needed help because he was blind. Yoon-ha asked again if the gentleman really couldn't see at all. The guide admitted that the noble gentleman had come to improve his health. There were armed men in the courtyard they were passing through. The girl remembered her conversation with the owner of the bookstore. It was interesting to know how many gold coins the nobleman was willing to pay for his efforts. The girl followed her escort to the place. She was met by a tall, dark-haired man who turned around abruptly and invited Yoon-ha to follow him. The girl hurried to follow him. Almost running, she moved after her guide. Soon they passed through a large deserted courtyard. The brunette walked without looking back. He gave the girl instructions not to chatter in vain, but to wait for the master's order, and he also advised her not to get up from her knees. He dryly asked if the girl understood everything, and soon he heard an affirmative answer. They stopped at the entrance to the room. The servant addressed the master. He said that the cheonggisu was already in place. There was a voice giving permission to enter, and the sliding doors of the room opened. The girl entered and froze. She stared at the gentleman in surprise. The young lady could not believe that the employer was really blind. After all, it was not at all noticeable from his appearance. A muscular man sat in a relaxed pose. His robe was open on his chest. A pipe with a long mouthpiece was smoking in his hand. Hun-ha immediately thought that Jusi-song had gotten something wrong. This man did not seem blind to her. A voice brought her out of her thoughts. The girl was asked to come closer. The young lady approached a short distance with fear and knelt down. But the master ordered her to come even closer. Yoon-ha was afraid. She swallowed nervously and moved a little closer. But the master ordered her to move even closer. The guest begged and declared that if she came closer, she would touch the master's body. He grabbed the girl by her clothes and pulled her towards him. Fear splashed in Yoon-ha's eyes. The man took her head with both hands and began to sniff, and then stroke her lips with his finger. He was surprised that although the guest was dressed in men's clothing, he had a feminine scent. The gentleman assured that because of his blindness, in order to understand, he first needed to touch, so he asked him to understand. The young man asked if the guest had seen the book. He wanted to assess how good it was before deciding on payment, so he asked her to read something of her choice. Hyun-ha was surprised that all she had to do was read it and asked again. She couldn't understand what this man had in mind. And was this really a test to check her skills? And the girl, sitting on her knees, began to read aloud, randomly opening a page of the proposed book. After finishing the page, Yoon-ha closed the book. She thought to herself that this style of writing was very different from what she usually read. This one was more like Sansamun. The gentleman praised her abilities, and then he asked what the price of her voice was, and the girl decided to think it over. First, there was a gentleman who introduced himself as blind. Second, the house was like a palace hidden in the mountains. And finally, a book whose contents were somewhat dangerous. Based on all this, Yoon-ha made a decision. The girl announced the price of her voice at 1,000 nyong. In her heart, she knew that this was a ridiculously high price for her services. She waited anxiously for the gentleman's answer, but he assured her that he would quadruple the payment. However, from then on, her voice would be his property. The sun was already setting behind the mountains, painting them with warm tones for the last time. Nature was getting ready to go to sleep. The employee who walked Yoon-ha to the door advised her to keep quiet about what she was doing there. He also ordered her to come here tomorrow before sunset without being late. He assured her that disobeying the master's orders would be severely punished. The doors closed and Yoon-ha was left alone. Exhaling, she began to reassure herself that everything would be fine and tried to calm herself down. Being there in a strange place, Yoon-ha felt as if she was locked in a cage with a hungry tiger. But strangely enough, part of her did not want to tear her gaze away from such a mesmerizing appearance. At first, when she heard the sisters' conversation in Bwangwan, the girl thought the man was strange. But now she realized that such strong men made her feel heat and pulsation in her lower abdomen. Yoon-ha pulled herself up short, realizing that she had been thinking about something completely different. And she shuddered involuntarily and thought that she had gone crazy. The girl could not say for sure whether the gentleman was blind or just pretending, but the reasons for his actions were unknown to the young lady. Standing at the gate, Yoon-ha muttered to herself. She only now realized how much the gentleman had offered for the service, and she was sure that with that amount, she could cross her sister's name off the list of kijaks. It was already dark. Night was approaching. The sister asked Yoon-ha what all this meant. She was surprised that she was leaving so suddenly. The younger one, without looking up at her sister, said that she was just helping a Jusi-san with his work. But the way to that place was not short. Therefore, it would be worth going there for a while. The elder one did not calm down, and asked what kind of help was being discussed. Yoon-ha answered that supposedly a relative of a Jusi was rewriting books in a Western language, but he did not have enough assistance for this. The original books were priceless and difficult to transport. It was a question of decent pay, and also the possibility of visiting my sister every 2 weeks. The sister took the younger sister by the shoulder and demanded to look into her eyes. She wanted to make sure that the work was only copying. Yoon-ha made an effort and confirmed it with a smile. After all, a Jusi could be trusted. The elder hugged her and asked for forgiveness. After all, if she hadn't had so many weaknesses, Yoon-ha wouldn't have had to suffer so much. The younger one asked her not to say that. She assured that she would finish as soon as possible and then come back, and also asked to send a letter if something happened through a Jusi. The sister started to tell Yoon-ha about young Master Yun, but stopped mid-sentence. She thought that the girl would probably not see him for a long time, so there was no point in bothering her head about it. The younger one became alarmed, misunderstanding the unfinished sentence that there was something wrong with the young master. And thinking that he might be bored, she decided to visit him before leaving. The sister asked the younger one to take care of herself, and assured her that she would notify everyone in Bwangwan. Yoon-ha thanked her. The older Gisang heard this conversation. This puzzled her quite a bit, but she didn't lose her head, even though she admitted to herself that she had initially made a mistake by giving the girls another chance. She waved her hand imperiously and ordered everyone to get ready so that not one of those obstinate girls would leave Bwangwan. Soon, 2 strong male servants were leading Yoon-ha by the arms to the eldest Gisang. The girl was asking Lady Hansu why she was suddenly doing this to her. The Gisang stated that from today onwards, she would. Yoon-ha will not be allowed to leave Bwangwan without her personal permission. Approaching, Hansu lifted the young girl's chin like a fan, and said that this beautiful face could not be hidden by men's clothing. The eldest of the sisters rushed to the lady with a plea, and asked her not to misunderstand Yoon-ha. She assured that she was not going to the young master. She was just leaving for a short time for work. Hansu stated that the lies flowed so naturally from the girl's lips that one could tell that she was a real Kisang. The woman assured that she had given him enough chances, but the ungrateful one had missed every single one of them. And what's more, she didn't finish. But she remembered her previous conversation with her son. The young man demanded not to dare touch Yoon-ha. He also demanded that the girl not be pressured using Lee Yeon, and then, following his mother's wishes, he would live as Yun Panso's son. Hansu said that eating delicious food and living comfortably in her Bwangwana was not a blessing from heaven, and Sister Eun-ha was just a jungi. The lady couldn't understand why such a young person acted as if she didn't know about it. The senior Kisang stated that if the girl was not shy around men, she should have quickly gotten used to her future role. The elder one begged to spare her sister, But Hensu only pulled her hand away from her in disgust. The manager asked the servants what they were waiting for, and ordered that the obstinate person be locked up immediately. Yun-ha, held by two men, called for her sister. Here our heroine remembered the words of the servant who had seen her off. Fear overcame the girl. After all, disobeying the will of the master was punishable, and she did not know what this could turn out to be for her. Yun-ha sat on the floor, guarded by three men, and thought. She realized that something was wrong here. She assumed that there was a conversation between her sister and Hainsu that she didn't know about. The girl didn't understand why her sister had mentioned Mr. Yun then. She didn't think it was because she disliked their communication. Then the door creaked open, attracting our heroine's attention. It was Chun-hee. She quickly approached the girl and said that now was not the time to behave like that. After all, Hainsu really was going to put Yun-ha in the kijiok. She did not understand why everything had changed so abruptly. Yun-ha asked if the girl knew anything. After all, she was Hansu's personal maid, and also the closest to her sister. She was worried that there was a meeting scheduled that she absolutely had to attend. Chun-hee reported that a Jussi song came shortly after Yun-ha was dragged away. But she didn't understand what the point was, and she assumed that she didn't understand that now she needed to think about what would happen next. After all, first she will be humiliated, being paraded before the nobility in only her undergarments. And after that, the commoners will be allowed to touch her wherever they want. This was the cruel reality that awaited Yun-ha. Fear appeared in the girl's eyes when she heard this. The girl wanted to say something to Chun-hee, but their conversation was interrupted by the doors being thrown open. The man said that Hansu had ordered all the preparations to be completed, and the girl sent to the pavilion for high-ranking officials. Yun-ha was shocked, and she absolutely did not want this. But Chun-hee demanded that she come to her senses. After all, if the girl refused, she would be forced to drink the aphrodisiac. And what was more important, they would all survive if Yun-ha went there, or rather her sister. Pulling at her clothes, the girl asked if she really wanted her sister to be executed. She instructed him to walk as lightly as a butterfly, to smile like a blossoming flower, and to let her enjoy the scent of a real woman. Meanwhile, she washed and dressed Yun-ha. Chun-hee asked her not to occupy her thoughts with anything else, but to gracefully receive the waiting guests. Ki-sang dressed and combed Eunha's hair, and then she began to powder her face. She assured that this was the only way for the girl and her sister to survive. To complete the preparations, Chun-hee applied lip balm to the young lady's lips. Soon Yun-ha came out of the room where her escort was already waiting for her. When he looked at her, the girl involuntarily shuddered. The man said she was here. A voice from behind the door told her to come inside. Our heroine timidly stepped onto the threshold, slightly opening the door. Today, she was wearing unfamiliar shoes, and her whole image was radically different from what she was used to wearing. The peach-colored clothes set off her blush, and her hair was braided in a tight but modest braid. Entering the pavilion, the girl immediately sat down on her knees not far from the entrance. She glanced timidly at those present and was extremely surprised. The same blind but beautiful gentleman, his servant, and Ki-sang nearby. Scattered things and dishes were everywhere. "Closer," the master ordered. Yegi and Yun-ha cleared the long table. "Come here," he called to the timid girl. "Let's go back half an hour." It was a quiet winter evening. Soft light was streaming from the windows of the houses. A group of girls were discussing the noble guest. They said that he was blind and came with a guard, and his status was higher than General Panso, since Hansu herself was helpless before him. They whispered about how young he looked. One of them said that it was the first time she had seen such a young, elegant man. The girl confessed that the beauty of all the Ki-sangs could not compare to his appearance. At this time, the young man who was being discussed was sitting in the establishment and sipping a drink. He placed the tiny vessel on the table with a thud. Then he asked the owner of the establishment if it was true that she couldn't bring Yun-ha to him now. The woman immediately gave a positive answer. She explained this by the fact that the young girl still had not raised her hair. Hansu offered to pick up a similar girl if the gentleman wished, but the man categorically refused. He asked if the lady thought that the whole journey was made for the sake of fakes, and he sharply replied that if that was the only problem, he would lift the young lady's hair himself. The owner of the establishment asked how that was possible. The nobleman refilled the vessel from the clay jug and turned to his servant Yul-jai. He stated that he was beginning to get irritated by having to repeat himself. A dark-haired stately man stood next to his master, As he spoke, he took hold of the hilt of his sword. The high Jisang trembled, and Yul-jae began to strike deadly blows left and right with sharp movements. Blood spurted in all directions. People wheezed in mortal agony. The owner of the establishment was all splashed with the blood of her employees. She turned to the noble gentleman in horror. The woman admitted that she was wrong. Her head touched the floor in front of the man. Hansu tightly closed her eyes and did not rise from the floor. She promised to order Yun-ha to be brought here right away. The young man continued to silently sip the alcoholic drink from the tiny vessel. He touched his clean-shaven chin and said out loud that soon the alcohol would become even sweeter. There were soft footsteps. Yun-ha appeared in the half-open door. She was dressed beautifully. The lamps on the sides emitted a soft light. The girl entered the room and stopped in surprise. Her eyes widened in surprise. There were bodies of murdered men on the floor. The owner of the establishment was also on the floor, bowing. The noble gentleman was sitting at a low table. He ordered the girl to come closer. The young lady was frightened and surprised by what was happening, and the man insisted that she come to him. The girl looked around and did not understand what was happening. Her small feet in soft shoes walked uncertainly on the blood-stained floor. The gentleman in expensive clothes raised a pipe with a long mouthpiece to his lips. There was silence in the room. Suddenly, the young man stood up from his seat. His servant was immediately there and supported his master. But the man refused to help. He waved his hand to stop Yul-jae and assured him that everything was fine. The noble gentleman moved towards the frozen girl. His feet confidently stepped on the floor, sticky with blood. The man came close to Yun-ha and raised his hand to touch her. The girl was trembling, looking down at the floor. Suddenly, a loud laugh echoed through the room. It was the noble gentleman laughing, and the girl at that moment was terrified. The man continued to smile. He asked Yun-ha if she was afraid to touch him this time too. Then, frowning, he said that it was unfortunate. After all, after touching, the lips met in a kiss and the bodies intertwined. The gentleman touched the frightened girl's face and explained that he was checking the owner of the establishment. He suspected her of wanting to deceive the blind man and bring him another woman. Holding the young lady by the chin, he assured her that when he touched her, he immediately recognized her. The man told about strange rumors that made him think that their meeting would not take place. The girl asked what these rumors were. The owner of the establishment shuddered when she heard the next words. The young man had heard rumors about attempts to harm the girl. It was as if someone had grabbed and locked the young lady, not allowing her to come to the man. Yun-ha knew that the gentleman would be extremely angry if she said something wrong, so she replied that it was not like that. The girl told about a small misunderstanding, because of which she could not go out, but she assured that she planned to come to the man as soon as possible. The gentleman half turned towards the side where the owner of the establishment was. He told the girl that they were going to put her in the kijak. The frightened Hansu began to admit her mistake. The noble guest said that he had promised the girl 4,000 yang, so the woman would have to pay twice as much, but he was sure that she could not afford it. Hansu was clenching her fists in anger. The richly dressed man abruptly stopped talking and leaned decisively towards the girl. He hugged her and leaned towards her shoulder. The young lady was confused, and he asked if she was tired. The master bent down to Yun-ha and froze. It seemed as if he was breathing the girl. Then he ordered his servant to carefully examine her face. His orders were clear and understandable. The servant could not miss a single scratch or other wound. Yul-jae needed to remember everything in the smallest detail and find out who did what. The servant briefly responded with agreement. The owner of the establishment looked at this picture with horror. She slowly raised her head. Her face and body were splattered with blood. The woman's angry eyes were blazing with rage. She was furious and thought badly of the girl. The nobleman still held the young beauty in his arms. Then he called her name. Yun-ha responded immediately. The man quietly spoke his proposal. He asked the girl to stay close to him and become his eyes. Without ceasing to embrace the young lady, the gentleman remarked that it was now time to return home. In the quiet of the room, Yun-ha sat on the floor, hugging her knees. The candlelight dimly illuminated the dwelling. The huge space surprised the girl. It was a spacious room with beams on the ceiling. Painted screens were located near the wall, and now she would live here. The girl was crying. She wiped her tears with her hand and thought about what she should do. Yun-ha recalled the destruction in the room they were in. She did not understand why so many people died. The girl remembered the angry look of the owner of the establishment and thought that it seemed that Hansu had misunderstood something. The young lady hugged herself. She still felt sick. Her shoes were stained with blood. Hyun-ha hugged her knees and rested her head on them. She hoped that this wouldn't affect her sister. The girl remembered how she had asked the gentleman to stay at least one more day, but she had received a negative answer. The young lady decided to make another request just in case. She just had to wait until dawn. Propping her head up with her palm, Hyun-ha thought that she should take a bath first. The huge double doors were closed. On both sides in the lamps a fire was burning. The light slightly dispelled the gloom of the room. The girl did not understand where the bathhouse was. She thought about what she could ask, but there was no one around. Hyun-ha opened one door and looked around tensely. The girl's eyes widened in surprise. A cry of amazement escaped from her chest. She froze in delight. Thick steam rose above the place for ablution and many candles burned around. This splendor was nothing compared to the girl's bath in Buyongwon. A pleasant aroma hung in the air. Hyun-ha quickly threw off her outerwear and decided to quickly take a bath and leave. There was silence all around. Only rustling sounds betrayed the girl's presence in the bath. She carefully moved towards the bath. Suddenly she was distracted by a loud sound. Something thundered and the girl looked around. A young man walked quickly through the door of the bathhouse. His face and expensive clothes were dirty. There were splashes of blood on them. Hyun-ha dropped down suddenly and hid behind the edge of the bathtub. She was afraid to make any sound, so she covered her mouth with her hand. It was the gentleman. He stopped and seemed to be thinking about something. The bathhouse was filled with steam and pleasant aromas. In the semi-darkness, the man began to slowly take off his clothes. Drops of blood on his skin reflected in the dim light. Horror splashed in the girl's eyes. Had she accidentally ended up in the master's bathhouse? Clenching her hands into fists in fear, the young lady tried to find a way to get out of there. The half-naked man turned towards the bathtub and his gaze froze. The girl froze in an uncomfortable position. Time seemed to stand still. The gentleman standing before Hyun-ha's eyes began to slowly move towards the bath. The girl thought the man noticed her, but she didn't understand how this could happen. Hyun-ha closed her eyes tightly and lowered her head even lower. She knew that if that was the case, then she would be in trouble. There was a splash of water. The young lady opened her eyes in surprise and listened. Slowly, the girl rose from her hiding place. The man was sitting in the bathtub. The petals of scarlet flowers were swaying on the surface of the water. Hyun-ha swallowed hard and watched the gentleman with all her eyes. She thought about it and was glad that he didn't see her. While the man was enjoying the water treatments, the young lady convinced herself that he really was blind. The girl understood perfectly well that, having noticed her, the gentleman would definitely not remain silent, and it was obvious that even if this man was blind, he was undoubtedly accustomed to moving around in a familiar place. Her gaze dropped to the floor and she wondered where all that blood came from. The girl remembered that his outfit was clean, and now there was a pile of blood-stained clothes lying on the floor. Squatting over the edge of the huge bathtub, Hyun-ha thought. She had no idea what kind of person the gentleman was. The girl thought, this man looked like a nobleman. However, it was strange that he settled in such a deserted place. Suddenly I remembered his imperturbable smile, and also not being afraid to spill someone else's blood. Hyun-ha rubbed her forehead in thought. She still wasn't sure if she had done the right thing by following him. As long as the girl was next to the master, she could feel calm. The main thing was not to go against his will, and then he would definitely keep his promise. Lost in thought, the young lady missed the moment when something changed in the bathhouse. The girl looked up and saw the figure of the gentleman nearby. He was standing at full height, practically next to her. The man bent down to pick up the towel. Drops of water were running down his naked body. Suddenly, he turned around sharply and approached the place where Hyun-ha was hiding. Before the eyes of the frightened young lady appeared a rather large bulge in the man's wet pants. The half-naked gentleman froze in front of the girl, and a mysterious grin appeared on his handsome face. Hyun-ha thought it was impossible that a part of a man's body could be so big and terrifying. The girl was afraid that the gentleman was so close to her, and he said as if to himself that he had not relaxed for a long time. Our heroine thought that if he had guessed about her presence, he would not have done such a thing. Hyun-ha watched the man's actions. She began to feel so strange. Her body seemed to have gone rigid and her breathing was caught. It seemed that the gentleman who had touched her face a couple of hours ago and the man who was opposite her were different people. Coming out of the bathhouse and already on the street, the master gave orders to his assistant, so that he would find the one who would spread the rumor that So Ji-hak had brought a Chongisu to his house. People had to know that the man was dressed in men's clothes and was asked to read to the master. He wanted everyone to desperately want to know the identity of the Chongisu. It sounded tempting to him. After all, it was interesting to look at the expression on the girl's face when she was cornered. He told the servant to wait until it came out of the bath, and then to give him a day to visit the village when the sun rose. The gentleman looked over his shoulder. The clerk assured him that everything would be done. The young man told the elder that he had not visited Hare for a long time, but today His Excellency looked gloomy. He sat in front of his father, and he assumed that something might have happened, and his father wasn't sure whether the news was good or bad. But in any case, it was worth keeping an eye on him. The son could not understand who was being talked about. It turned out that they were talking about the presence of the former crown prince. It was known that the madman lost his sight due to poison tea and lost his title of crown prince. And now Seoji Hak was here in Hare. But whether he was truly blind, whether he had completely gone mad, or whether he was planning to regain his position, the father was going to see for himself. And he believed that the time had come to put an end to this conflict. It was simply unthinkable that the former crown prince who had caused a commotion in the palace would suddenly arrive in Hare. The father said that soon there would be unrest in the house. Therefore, he advised the young man to refrain from rash actions. He turned a blind eye to his son's debauchery, but he asked him not to forget his calling. After all, his father counted on him more than on his other sons. Although the young man hid behind the status of an illegitimate child, however, as soon as everything was over, they would find him a worthy wife. Therefore, the young man should forget about the past and focus on the Kwago, the state exam for high-ranking officials. The elder advised his son to remove all obstacles that could potentially poison his future. The young man thought about the word obstacles. He understood perfectly well what his father wanted to tell him, but he did not want to allow that child to be spoken of in that way. And suddenly he remembered how, as a boy, he sat near a tree by the wall. He was all alone and lost in sad thoughts. At some point, a girl even younger than him approached him and asked who he was. She had never met the boy before and assumed that he might have gotten lost. The little girl bent down and began to examine him. The boy stood up and complained that his mother did not want to see him. Anxiety and regret appeared in the eyes of the interlocutor. The girl resolutely placed her burden on the crunchy snow, and in that case, she offered to keep him company until he decided where to go next. Of course, Yoon-ha didn't suspect it at all back then. But from the second the boy saw her, like a delicate flower blooming in the snow, and to this day, his feelings for her continued to grow. And now it seemed to the young man that all his thoughts were occupied only with her. Therefore, he would not be able to imagine his future without his Yoon-ha. Meanwhile, the girl was quickly trudging along the road. She could not understand why the gentleman had suddenly changed his mind. Eun-ha's body was burning as she recalled the previous night. She didn't even remember how she returned to her room. But now was not the time to think about such things. She was going to make sure that everything was okay with her sister. And approaching the door, the girl began to turn her head in different directions. Gathering her courage, she pushed the doors open wide. There, she was already met by two armed men. One of them muttered that Yoon-ha had come after all, and he told her loudly that Hansu was already waiting for her inside. The senior Kisang assured that she had guessed that the girl would want to visit her sister, and her decision to post guards turned out to be correct. Kneeling down in respect, Yuna asked where her sister was now. Hansu told her in a condescending tone that she had sent her to the laundry, and that the wretch had been washing her dirty underwear by hand all night. The girl screamed indignantly. The lady believed that she had to teach the girl everything properly, since she had forgotten how she had achieved her position. Yoon-ha assured that she would prepare the ransom, and demanded that her sister be removed from the kijok. She assured that she wanted to repay the kindness shown, and she wanted to go far away with her sister, so that no one would hear about them. Laughing, Hansu demanded that they bring her 8,000 nyan. Surprise and confusion appeared on our heroine's face. The woman said that the price of that girl was 5,000, but Belgum asked to make her his concubine. Therefore, another 3,000 will be needed to calm his heart. She asked Yoon-ha if she thought she could earn the ransom for her sister. The girl could not understand how it was possible to ask for such a huge amount. Hansu believed that the ward had to pay in full for the shame that had covered her. And if the girl wanted to ransom her sister so much, she could have asked that noble gentleman. The older Gisang suggested that if she served him properly and fondled his loins a couple of times, she could get what she wanted. Yoon-ha tearfully cried out that she was just a junggisu to the master. Hansu suggested that he let the blind man enjoy her sweet voice and relax and accept whatever he needed from him. The woman gave Eun-ha a resounding slap, and she asked how such a worthless person could dare to say something against her. But then her son's voice stopped her. The young man asked his mother what was happening here. The woman asked Shi-hong what he was doing here. But he was surprised that in such a situation, this was the only question that his mother was concerned about. Hyun-ha whispered to her friend. The young master asked the girl not to move. But then the mother turned to him and angrily asked whether His Excellency had spoken to the boy. The woman winced at the way the young gentleman addressed her as mother, and he assured her that it didn't matter how hard she tried to draw the line by addressing him formally. He believed that this would not change his status as a Kisang's illegitimate child. The young man took Eun-ha's elbow, supporting her, and asked his mother to make wise decisions in the future if she wanted her son to follow her instructions. He assured her that he would never lose what was dear to him. The door creaked, and on the threshold our heroine saw her sister. She was also surprised that she even dropped the laundry basket from her hands. Later in the room, the girl saw everything that her older sister had prepared for her. There were also her favorite books that Ajusi-san had given to the girl. She also packed Eun-ha's favorite fadeok. The girl touched the younger one's cheek, which had suffered from Hansu's slap and was now burning with fire. Eun-ha took the older one by the hand and asked what happened to them. Then she realized that because of her, Hansu bullied her sister, even though she had done nothing wrong. Then a young gentleman approached them. The sister asked Eun-ha not to worry because it was not her fault. There was simply a misunderstanding between her and the teacher. Their conversation was interrupted by a young man. He assured her that everything would be fine in the future, and asked the girl to come to him if something like this happened again. But the eldest of the sisters assured the young master that she did not want to cause him any more trouble. But the young man assured that the girls became his salvation. After all, without Eun-ha, he would most likely have grown up to be a shameless and irresponsible person. His revelation surprised both of them. The elder one slumped her shoulders and hung her head, although she knew that the young master and her sister cared for each other. But perhaps they were also mutually in love. They always took care of each other. They shared both happy and hard times. Thanks to this incident, the girl realized that if the relationship between Hansu and her younger sister had worsened, it was probably because the lady suspected that there was something between them. And that's why the woman demanded such an absurd ransom and used her as bait. Still, Eun-ha was glad that the young master would look after his sister while she was away for a while. After all, the girl didn't want her only relative to face hardships due to the difference in social status, but she also didn't want to break her heart at the same time. The young master advised Eun-ha to hurry up before the sun set and assured her that he was going to take her. The girl refused and assured him that she would get there without any problems, but he said that he would worry and suggested that they start getting ready as soon as possible. The young man jokingly threatened that if Eun-ha did not hurry up, he would eat all the pateok, and she played along, saying that it was not appropriate to behave like that. A cheerful laugh was heard. The older sister watched their fun from the side, lost in thought. It was a moonlit night. Nothing disturbed the silence in the courtyard where the former crown prince had settled. Hyuna caught her breath. She decided that she should first thank the master for allowing her to return to the village. She muttered to herself that in return she would have to read him as many books as he wanted. The girl decided that as long as she was here, she would do her job diligently. And when she received the payment, she would try to talk to Hansu again. Eun-ha understood that of course her plan was not flawless, but while the lady was in a bad mood, it was better not to talk to her about her sister once again. Remembering the tiger hunt, our heroine adopted life experience. If you can't defeat a giant beast, it was worth luring it into a trap and staying alert to survive at all costs. The room filled with smoke from the pipe the moment our heroine entered it. Hyun-ha gathered her courage and addressed the gentleman. She declared her willingness to come closer to him if he allowed her. The former crown prince chuckled, looking over his shoulder with a sly look. 10 years ago, somewhere in the yard, loud, sharp blows were heard. Screams of pain were heard. The man crucified on the platform begged for mercy. People crowded around. They silently watched what was happening. The man screamed in pain. He tried to prove his innocence. He claimed that he could not have had any affair with the lady. The man insisted that he was a simple reader, and he swore by his children. Near the place of execution, his 2 little daughters were crying. Suddenly, one of the girls broke loose and ran. You could hear the little girl quickly stamping her feet. The brave defender began to beg for mercy for her father. Tears flowed from the little girl's eyes, but she firmly grabbed the hand of her father's tormentor. The girl tried to convince the Punisher that her father was good. He entertained people with his stories, and that he was innocent. Suddenly, she felt a strong kick and fell. She was ordered to shut up. Little Yunha felt the blow. She heard indignation at the behavior and rude words addressed to her. Following this, there was an order to take her. The girl watched her father's torment with horror. At that time, she could not understand why he was accused of disrespecting the nobility. He was a simple Chong-Isu. The baby was being beaten and trampled. Yunha tried to block the blows, but they came from all sides. She realized that they all just needed an excuse. The girl emerged from her bitter memories. She mentally regretted that everything had turned out this way with her father. The gentleman stood with his back to Yunha, but suddenly turned around sharply. The girl thought about how her father would not approve of the path she had chosen. She had a plan to work as a Chong-Isu just once. What would happen next? She did not have time to think about. The gentleman approached the girl silently. He slowly extended his hand to her face. The girl froze in fear. The man crouched down in front of Yunha. He noticed her determination and courage. She had managed to come closer after all. But he also noticed how the girl froze and held her breath at that moment. The gentleman slowly stroked the frightened girl's face. He was thoughtful. He touched her burning cheek and noted that there was heat there. The girl flinched when the man took her face in his hands. He expressed displeasure because he asked her to be careful, and she hurt her face. The lovely Chong-Isu began to stutter out of fear. She tried to convince the man that she did it herself. The gentleman doubted it. The girl began to explain that she had hit herself to collect her thoughts. She did not want to make any mistakes while she was reading to the gentleman. The man was surprised. He leaned closer to Yunha's face and ran his thumb over her lips. The girl froze. She opened her small mouth slightly when the gentleman pressed on her lower lip. He admitted that he was flattered by her attention to him. The man's finger slid into the frightened girl's mouth. The young lady gasped in surprise. The gentleman moved his finger in the girl's mouth. The man noticed that everything inside her was very swollen. His finger became wet. The nobleman seemed to have lost track of time. The girl called out to the man and made him wake up. The gentleman held Yunha by the chin and warned her that he would let her get away with it this time. The girl was scared and looked at the man with huge eyes. The man licked his finger. He promised that if the girl obeyed, he might let her leave the house. But he said with a threat that he would not forgive a second disobedience. A young gentleman in rich clothes sat and looked somewhere ahead. Yunha was opposite him. They were alone in the room. The girl opened the book that was lying on her lap. She bowed her head and decided to start reading. The book spoke of humility and respect. They were shown to a person of high status. Yunha read about the respect and admiration for a man of high position. They wished him the greatness that was destined for him. The master listened attentively. His hand tapped nervously on his knee. The gentleman listened to the voice of the Chong-Isu. For a while he even forgot about his pipe. He was carried away by how the author subtly hinted at his hard lot and the blows of fate. The girl was absorbed in reading and her voice echoed throughout the room. Suddenly she was distracted by extraneous sounds. Yunha jumped in surprise. The gentleman sat down next to her. He laid his head on the girl's lap and asked her to continue reading. The man explained his actions by his desire to simply hear the girl more clearly. Yunha was confused and worried that the gentleman would be uncomfortable, but he promised that he would stand up if he felt uncomfortable. The girl closed her eyes. She thought about how the master could always be so unwavering. Despite the bloodshed in Buyongwan, Hensu left the matter as if nothing had happened. She ordered her subordinates to keep their mouths shut. This spoke of the high status of the master. The girl continued reading. The man lay there, his head on her lap. Sometimes he smoked his pipe. Yunha decided to look at him. She began to examine the man. He suddenly said that he suddenly became curious about what the girl looked like. The reader was surprised. The girl quickly replied that she had the ugliest face in the world. The man burst out laughing. In his opinion, she has clear and sincere eyes. He admitted that when he imagined such an image, he remembered his childhood. The gentleman said that he had not been blind since birth. One day his vision became clouded, and before an important event he became completely blind. Rumors were circulating that poison was to blame. Someone had poisoned him out of hatred. The man felt as if cold snakes were slithering over his body, wrapping themselves tighter and tighter around him. The gentleman held in his hands a ribbon from the girl's dress. He called her by name. The man pulled the bow and forced Yunha to lean closer to him. He confessed that the girl resembled the creature he possessed at the time. In the past, he had failed to overcome his anger, and the life of this creature had ended. Their gazes met. The man hoped that maybe this time he would be able to control his emotions. That time he couldn't control his anger and broke that creature's neck. Yun-ha didn't know what the gentleman was talking about, and she assumed that he was talking about the one he once loved very much. Looking at the man, she could not understand who would do this to his beloved. And he played with her braid. Catching herself that she was simply staring at him, the girl blushed, and in order to avoid awkwardness, she suggested continuing reading. And she decided to consider those words as a cruel and unsuccessful joke. Yun-ha asked if the story about the master's blindness was true, and if he lost his sight because of the poison, it must have been very painful for him. Our heroine thought about it, and mentally asked what he had to go through. The girl decided that she wanted to know more about the gentleman, but on the other hand, she was afraid to cross the line. The moon in the night sky. Snow. A man was sitting in the yard and smoking. He was deep in thought. Kisan reported to His Royal Highness. She fell to her knees before the ruler. The woman insisted that the crown prince was unworthy, and therefore the young man had to immediately renounce his rights to the throne. She assured that the heavens would cry, and the earth would collapse from the sins committed. And this cannot be done. But a man with a bloody katana was already standing next to her. He said that it was worth forgetting about what happened, and it was impossible for what happened to affect him. The servant greeted the master with a bow. He asked how everything had gone. The man assured them that, as expected, they had been in cahoots with the murdered Bueng Wen. The servant applied the luminous powder, and by this time their clothes should have already left marks, and that meant that if there was ganja in the house with them, it could be recognized by its dark blue glow. The gentleman put down his pipe and commanded to move out. 2 people were walking along a snowy, untrodden forest path late at night. But then they saw tracks in the snow that shone in the darkness. The young man frowned, realizing that danger was near. Then something buzzed above his ear, cutting his cheek superficially. Drops of scarlet blood dripped from the wound. The assistant became alarmed for the gentleman and called out to him, and his hand fell on the handle of the rope. But he, with an expressive gesture, ordered silence. Many feet were running along this forest path, and there were at least 30 people following in their footsteps. The crown prince had set a trap for them, and they decided to use it against him. The assistant said that he had not taken his sword out of its sheath for a long time, and he pulled the weapon by the handle. The gentleman glanced over his shoulder and nodded to his assistant, giving his go-ahead to begin the action. The young man was already ready. There was a whistle, and then the archers appeared as if from nowhere. The guy gave them a sign with his hand. Soon the whole group gathered around the master, who gave the order to capture 2 alive and kill the rest. The weather was clear and sunny. Birds were flying in the sky. The ringing singing of birds could be heard. Yun-ha was sorting through the things her sister had packed for her on the trip, and she realized how much she had cared for her. Chewing the fat talk carefully packed in a bundle with gusto, she felt pleasure, and she hoped that her sister was not hungry there either. And then the girl suddenly remembered that a juicy son had given the book through his sister, and she began to look for it in her things. Yun-ha was delighted to find the book, but then a piece of paper folded many times slipped out of the publication. The girl guessed that this note was addressed to her. A juicy son wrote that he realized how much she needed money now. That's why he suggested that she take a look at the book. He assured that such stories were now gaining popularity among the nobility. The man offered to translate them from a Western language. Intrigued, our heroine hastened to open the book given to her by the kind librarian, but as she rustled the pages, she immediately froze at what she saw. The contents of this publication shocked her. The girl asked her partner not to leave her, and begged him to touch her. The young man replied that she was the only one who had been so cruel to him. He put his arm around his interlocutor, and touching her head, he threw off her scarf, revealing her beautiful face and hair. Soon the young man's robe lay on the dusty path. The girl trembled from his activity and caresses. When her partner stopped, she wanted more again. It seemed like this was the deadly poison she so desperately needed. The book fell to the floor, accidentally dropped by Yun-ha. The girl wondered what it was. She covered her mouth with her hands in horror. Our heroine couldn't believe that the nobility really loved to read such things. There was a knock on Yun-ha's door, disturbing her privacy. A voice behind the door asked if it was anyone. The girl flinched as if she had been caught red-handed. She hurried to close the book and pressed it to her chest. Looking over her shoulder at the newcomer, she asked what had happened. It turned out that the guest had asked her to leave for a while. The stranger was younger than our heroine. She introduced herself as Ga-ri and said that she had no last name. Yun-ha introduced herself in response and assured that the name of the interlocutor was quite beautiful. The girl was one of the master's servants, and she was ordered to show the lands to an older girl, and so she offered to follow her. Ga-ri showed the servants' quarters and a separate building for the kitchen. She said that among the servants there were some whom the master had brought with him, but most were from Hair. The girls sat and ate sweets. Yun-ha asked the youngest one if the gentleman was at home, and she complained that she knew nothing about him. Ga-ri stated that she knew that the gentleman was not inferior to high-ranking officials in status, and she assured that her master was the consul general. The girl clarified that she was his wife's servant, but she was sent here to help a blind nobleman. It turned out that he had lost his sight not long ago, and our heroine compared Ga-ri's words with the gentleman's words, which matched. Yun-ha asked what the gentleman usually did. The girl said that he usually sat in the room or left without warning, as was the case now. Sometimes he smoked in the place where they were now sitting. Ga-ri couldn't understand why the girl was interested in this. Our heroine, ready to be indignant, thought that she was right. She replied that she would serve the master for some time, but the girl wanted to give her advice, not to get involved with the gentleman once again, and she was going to warn her about something else. But she was interrupted. The young man scolded Ga-ri for blaspheming the master again. Both girls had guilty and embarrassed faces. The girl asked what he meant, and assured that she was simply worried about. But the young man chuckled and asked if this was the person everyone was gossiping about incessantly. And sitting down next to him, he introduced himself. Ho-rim assured him that he was one of the guards protecting the master. He extended his hand as a sign of acquaintance. Yun-ha shook the boy's hand. He assured her that the rice cakes looked very nice. He asked if she could try one. Ga-ri scolded him for asking after he had already put the food in his mouth. Our heroine chuckled quietly, watching how friendly the guys were. And then she decided that since the gentleman was surrounded by such good people, maybe he wasn't as cold as he seemed. The young man approached the master. He was sitting with his back to him. He looked over his shoulder at the call. The servant was communicating his decision to restore order here and return to Byeongwon. The man in the bloody clothes turned to the speaker. The servant suggested that they clean up the place and return to Byeongwon. The gentleman stood up abruptly. He rubbed his cheek with his hand and remarked that it seemed that the rumors had spread quickly, since the officials from Hansen had begun to arrive one after another. Byung-pan was among the first to arrive in Hari 15 days ago. He was given a residence where he lives with his family. They also set aside a special courtyard. The master asked if this place was in the Kisang's house. The servant confirmed it was. He explained that if many people gathered in the kibana, it would not arouse suspicion. The man thought that the meeting that was to take place the following night should not arouse suspicion either. Both warriors turned to the side where the bloody bodies lay. The gentleman admitted that he had tried to save the lives of two, but he lost his composure, and only one man remained alive. The surviving man was shaking with fear and uttering muffled groans. The master ordered his servant to seize him for interrogation. The brunette obeyed. The man turned around and was about to leave. Yul-jae started talking about the letter that came from Jag-hee-in. He asked what he should do with it. Without turning his head, the gentleman ordered the letter to be burned. He noted that this was already the second message in the last 15 days. Clenching his hands into fists, the interlocutor gave the order to deal with such things immediately in the future, without even asking him. The man never turned to face his servant, but he asked what that was doing at that moment. The brunette reported that, according to rumors, she had inspected the courtyard and shared her cooking with the servants. It was rice cakes with red beans. The noble gentleman thought about it. He grinned and noted that the young lady preferred the same food. The master gave the order and the two of them went to Byeongwon. The man thought that he had not had a good time for a long time. The winter evening had come into its own. Lights were burning in the windows of one of the Gisayang houses. The conversation was about the prince hiring a junggisu. The richly dressed men sat at a set table. They were talking about how the prince seemed to be forcing the junggisu to read to him. Some of those gathered expressed doubts about whether the prince was really blind. Byung-pan said that he still didn't believe it. Hadn't the young master become particularly insightful after receiving the title of crown prince? The man voiced his thoughts. It was hard to imagine that the crown prince had hired the first reader he came across. After his words, Everyone present looked at him nervously. An offer was made to pay a visit to the heir. Because no matter what rumors were going around, the young man already knew for sure that a delegation had arrived in Haro. One of those present said that he had learned from someone about the prince's Changyisu. He was told that it was a girl. It was decided that although they should all meet the prince, they first needed to capture the reader and try to lure him over to their side. Everyone in the room promised to give him all the support he could if Byong-pan took action. The man was given a drink and asked to let him know if he needed anything. They all need to be careful and sensible. The man reminded that there are still many people at the palace who demand that the title of crown prince be returned to the young man. Those gathered decided that it was necessary to tear out the roots completely before it was too late, and to destroy the one who was behind the palace intrigues. At this time, one of the Kisaengs was walking past the room where the nobles were talking. She exhaled sharply. It seemed that the situation was becoming more and more complicated. The owner of the establishment looked at Yan with disdain. She ordered the girl to do everything to make her excited if she did not want to experience the woman's wrath again. The girl hurried away. She understood that the main thing now was to calm the anger of the elder Hansu. Yan realized that even if the young master had tender feelings for her sister Yunha, the owner of the establishment knew nothing about it. The girl was trying to convince herself that everything would work out. She thought that she just needed to close her eyes and survive this night. Suddenly, someone grabbed her hand. This man turned out to be Mr. Byolgum. He was drunk. He hiccuped while talking, but he recognized the girl and was happy. Kisan pulled away from the man. He reeked of alcohol, but she politely asked why the man had left. It was cold outside. The gentleman's tongue was tied, but he managed to explain that he had not found a single Kisaeng, so he went out to find out what had happened. The girl smiled understandingly and promised to take him to the beautiful girls. She offered to follow her, but the man continued to hold her hand. Mr. Bulgum began to lift the girl's skirt with sharp movements. He objected, "Why go anywhere?" Kisang Yon tried to break free. She called out to her master, but he ordered her not to move. The girl resisted, but the man confessed that he had long asked to make her his concubine, and asked her to stop resisting. The movements of his hands were unpleasant to the girl. Tears froze in her eyes, and the man continued to talk about his desires in a rude manner. Stuttering, Kisang Yan begged for mercy. Mr. Byolgum urged the girl not to rush. His underwear fell with a rustle and spread out in a puddle around his legs. Suddenly, a loud sound cut through the air and a tuft of hair was cut off the persistent suitor's head. He froze in surprise. The cut hair fell to the ground with a loud slap. Both Kisang Yan and Byolgum froze in place in amazement. Footsteps were heard. A stately gentleman in rich clothes was approaching them. He was holding his katana in his hands. With a defiant smile on his face, the young man said that he had almost cut Bulgum's neck. Out of surprise and fear, the drunk Mr. Bulgum fell to the ground with a loud slap. He did not understand what was happening. A severed tuft of his hair lay nearby. The man let out a disgusting scream of fear. With a soft sound, the crown prince placed his katana against the drunkard's neck. In response, the drunkard only stared at his master in fear and hiccuped. The handsome man in expensive clothes looked at Gisang Yan. She was afraid to utter a word. She only pressed her hands to her mouth and trembled all over. The stern gentleman said that the Kisaeng looked like a naughty girl, so for a moment he thought that the drunkard was harassing her. A sharp movement, a soft scream, a splatter of blood. The girl fell to the ground in horror. She didn't take her eyes off what was happening. The nobleman glanced down at the frightened girl. He found that she had the same frightened look, but otherwise she was completely different. In the darkness of the street behind the man, the voice of a faithful servant was heard. He called out to his master. Yuljae held a cane in his outstretched arms which he extended to his master. The man took the staff and noticed that something had slipped his mind. The servant stared at the trembling girl. She continued to sit on the ground. The master said out loud that from now on it was necessary to properly play the blind man. The men left. Their footsteps echoed loudly in the empty space of the courtyard. Kisang Yan froze in place. She was afraid to even move. Eun-ha read. The book described that the nobility tends to turn away from the sovereign and seek ways to escape. In advance, currying favor with the owner of greater power. Candles were burning in the room. Scrolls were lying on the table. And the girl continued to read about how the sovereign is not free to choose the people, but is free to choose the nobility. For it is his right to punish and to pardon, to bring near or to disgrace. The young lady settled herself on her knees at the low table. The girl's voice filled the silence of the empty room. But the more she read, the more scared she became. The girl swallowed nervously. Eun-ha admitted to herself that her curiosity was still so great that she couldn't stop. She wondered what the Western region's sovereign would do. The dark silhouette of Yul-jae appeared behind the screen and distracted the girl from her thoughts. The man asked if the girl was there. The young lady shuddered in surprise. Having made sure that the reader was there, the servant voiced the master's order. She was to take the book and go to the bathhouse immediately. The girl was amazed by such an order. The gentleman was in the bathhouse. His naked torso was wet with steam. The splash of water mingled with the quiet voice of the Chong-Isu. The man stared motionlessly at one point. The girl read about possible actions on the part of the nobility, and whether they were ready to share the fate of the sovereign or not. The bathhouse was lit by a large number of lit candles. Eun-ha continued reading. The former, if they were not selfish, were recommended to be read and caressed. The young lady glanced over her shoulder. At the other end of the tub, a half-naked man was waist-deep in water. A soft splash could be heard. The girl quickly turned away. She could not understand why the master had called her to the bathhouse. She remembered the day when she hid in the bathhouse and secretly watched the master. The pictures from the book that Ajusi-san had given her also popped into her head. They still left the girl confused. Eun-ha was lost in thought and didn't notice the gentleman approaching her. She woke up when droplets of water began to drip onto the open book. The man noted that the girl usually chatted non-stop, but at the moment he couldn't get a word out of her. The half-naked man was propping his head up with his hand. He asked if something had happened while he was gone. The girl stuttered and said that nothing had happened. The young lady blushed under such close attention. She admitted that she had never been particularly talkative. Covering his mouth with his hand, the man quietly muttered that the girl was definitely different from that one. The girl did not hear and asked him again what he meant. The gentleman quickly changed the subject. He asked Eun-hee to wipe him down. The girl was embarrassed but mumbled her agreement. While wiping the man with a piece of soft white cloth, the young lady noticed that it seemed like the gentleman had drunk too much. The half-naked man thought for a moment and remained silent, but then he admitted that he was bored. The young assistant tried to explain to the gentleman that it was harmful to his body. She continued to wipe him. Suddenly, the man made a sharp movement. He leaned towards the girl and froze. She fell silent in fear and only her eyes widened in surprise. The gentleman sniffed the air next to Eun-ha. He admitted that the young lady gave off a scent of immaculate purity. Her attractive and sweet flesh was so different from the vicious and greedy smell. The girl was stunned by the confession. Having brought the young beauty closer to him, the man bit into her lips with a greedy, passionate kiss. The girl froze. Her eyes were open. She was afraid to move. The kiss was long. The girl felt her employer's hands on her body through her clothes. Eun-ha tried to push away the persistent man. She called out to him, but the hand of the half-naked gentleman was already sliding along the beauty's bare knee. The girl was scared. She looked at the man with huge eyes from below. She tried to somehow stop him, but the gentleman ignored her request. Suddenly he listened to something. Then he quietly made it clear that she should freeze and not talk. Someone else was nearby. The muscular man stood up abruptly and walked away from the girl. She was confused. Her eyes were filled with fear and confusion about what was happening. The man began to carefully step up the steps. Getting out of the bath, he ordered the girl to go back to his place. He was mentally angry that all the fun had been ruined in vain. The gentleman grabbed dry clothes from the shelf and began to put them on. He suddenly froze when he heard the young lady ask if he really couldn't see anything. The soft light of the burning candles wavered in the damp air. In the silence of the bathhouse, a counter-question sounded. The man wanted to know why the girl was asking about this. Eun-ha confessed. She felt like the owner was constantly watching her facial expression. It happened every time she spoke. The gentleman began to tie the sash of his robe. He asked if the girl had really cried because of him. A timid negative answer was given. The young lady hurried ahead and stood before her employer. Sincere words of apology were heard. She had made a mistake. Eun-ha grabbed the ends of the sash of the master's robe. The girl asked permission to tie them herself. She explained this by saying that the clothes were too transparent, and others could see the gentleman's body. The man asked if she didn't like it. The young lady was confused. Her eyes were lowered and looked down. The girl admitted that she simply did not want the gentleman's dignity to suffer. The man grabbed the young girl's hand and addressed her by name. He confessed that shame was the only word he did not know. He continued to talk about how the girl was holding the hand of a shameless man right now. Yoon-ha was taken aback by this confession. She was silent for a while. After thinking for a while, the girl replied that if that was so, then that was the same reason why the master had kissed her. They froze opposite each other. The man was not sure of the truth of her words. The next words stung the young beauty. The gentleman admitted that he simply wanted to taste what belonged to him. The man continued to hold Yoon-hee's hand tightly. The girl begged the master to let her go. He ran his Cheongisu's palm over his face. The owner wanted to know why she asked him to do this. It turned out that Yoon-ha now hated and feared him. The gentleman asked what to do in such a case. After all, the girl was his true pleasure. The man said this and gently touched the palm of the young lady with his lips. The winter day pleased with sunny weather. There were huge fir trees covered with snow around. Suddenly the silence was interrupted by a hoarse cough. Yoon-ha sat outside and coughed. She covered her mouth with her hand. She hoped she didn't catch a cold. The young woman especially mentally scolded herself, because the night before she went to bed without drying herself properly. Eun-ha's thoughts returned to the events in the bathhouse. She hoped that such a thing would not happen again in the future. And while she was thinking, she was being closely watched from the side. The young lady was making hypotheses about whether the master would ask her for something more or offer to be a Cheonggisu. A question sounded behind the girl. It sounded surprised that Nuna was in this place. Chun-ha jumped up and turned around. Guard Ho-rim was quickly approaching her. She recognized him. The young man asked why the girl was sitting there alone. The young man was glad to meet. He smiled sincerely. He admitted that he had been looking for a girl for a long time, and he put his hand under his clothes. With a joyful call to look at his hands, the young man extended them towards the girl. The young lady even covered her mouth with her palm in amazement. The young man explained that it was hot fattiok that had been steamed. He had heard that the girl liked malt syrup, so he added it on top. Chun-ha was amazed that the young man had brought her this. The guard replied that he had to repay her in kind. The young man did not finish his confession because he heard suspicious rustling nearby. The young man turned around abruptly and covered the girl with himself. He shouted for Yoon-ha to step back. The girl did not understand what was happening. The young man saw a huge snake that was hissing and wriggling. He wondered why this reptile did not hibernate, but crawled out. Taking a quick glance at Yoon-ha, the young man explained that it was extremely dangerous. He said that the girl had better move away. The young guard reasoned that he could catch the snake and then carry it up the mountain. But the snake was faster. It opened its mouth and rushed at the boy. Yoon-ha screamed in fear. Blood spurted. The reptile bit the guy on the arm. The girl ran up to Ho-rim. She ordered him not to move. He needed to get rid of the poison. The young lady pulled the sleeve of the guy's robe and exposed the bite site. Her lips approached the bleeding wound. The guy tried to stop her. Suddenly, someone's footsteps were heard, and the loud voice of the gentleman asked what the young people were doing there. Ho-rim looked at his master, confused and embarrassed like a naughty man, and he decisively took the katana from the servant. The sound of metal whistling through the air like lightning. Yoon-ha closed her eyes in fear. The girl heard that the master ordered Yul-jae to discipline her subordinates more diligently, and not to make such a fuss over one snake. Opening her eyes, our heroine saw the head of a scaly creature next to her, separate from her body. And the gentleman stood next to her with a katana in his hands, somewhat irritated. Yoon-ha accompanied the employer. She held his arm, trying to carefully lead him along the road. The man noticed that she was all burning, and he assumed that she had caught a cold. The girl glanced sideways at the gentleman. She was sure that he clearly saw what was happening in front of him. After all, without the slightest hesitation, he swung his sword and killed the viper. She didn't know if it was true that he was blind, but it wouldn't change anything anyway. Yuna couldn't recklessly betray him, and the master understood that very well. The girl assumed that the gentleman had some business here, since he brought her here with him. Chun-ha was happy that the snake only slightly touched Ho-rim, but she was still worried that she left him alone like that. Meanwhile, the merchant applied his goods to the hair of the young beauty. The gentleman asked the nail polish seller if there were better quality goods here. He assured him that there were, and he assured him that the decoration with butterflies and flowers would look great. The man reminded her that he was blind, and asked the assistant to choose something to her taste. Hyun-ha insisted that she really didn't need this, but he slammed his cane on the ground menacingly. Having paid the merchant, the man leaned over the young beauty and asked her to put on the jewelry every time she came to read to him. The girl wondered why this was necessary, since the gentleman would not see anything anyway. He smiled mysteriously in response, and he said that even though his eyes could not see, he could reach out and feel through touch. So he asked Yoon-ha not to be so afraid of him. The girl still shuddered from his touch. She suddenly remembered the moment in the bathhouse, how the gentleman touched her face with his hand, and how he asked about hatred or fear towards him. Even then he declared that the girl was his true pleasure. Hun-ha looked at the jewelry he gave her. She assumed that this was his way of apologizing, but she thought it would be better to just tell her directly. They ended up buying a lot more stuff that day. The gentleman complained that it was difficult to use the cane in crowded places. He said he simply had no choice but to rely on the assistant. Yoon-ha agreed to help and advised him to hold on tight. Then the girl started coughing, and the owner decided that she had caught a cold. It was a surprise to him that she would be so offended because of the previous night that she would even get sick. Yoon-ha asked who said that she was offended. But then they met a young man. The young master called Yoon-ha by name. He hurried over and asked how she ended up here. The men assessed each other with their eyes. The young man summed up that before him was a blind man in rich clothes and with a cane, and he made his own conclusions. The friend asked if the older sister knew what Yoon-ha was doing. He held the girl's hand tightly, but the gentleman took her by the chin and turned the girl's head towards himself, and he said that her body continued to burn. Just like last night, when he was drunk or when she was wet in front of her gentleman, the former crown prince called the girl to return so that he could take care of her, and he ordered the young man not to even think about spoiling his fun. The childhood friends looked at each other in silence, completely confused. Yoon-ha was the first to pull herself together, and taking his hand she promised to send him a letter soon. Soon the figure of the girl and her blind master were already moving away and were lost from sight in the crowd. Turning around, the young man saw Yoon-ha animatedly discussing something with the noble gentleman who had hired her. From the excess of emotions that tore at his heart and the impossibility of doing anything, he clenched his fists tightly. "How dare you?" escaped from his lips. The sunset painted the sky fiery colors. The buildings huddled in a group near the mountains, the servant reported to the young master. It turned out that the place where Yoon-ha was the personal residence of the great prince. There was a rumor that he hired a reader, but it was unthinkable that it would be Yoon-ha. A man was sent to find out more. It turned out that the master's mother and Lee Yeon had made a deal. Under those conditions, the girl would have to keep her sister away from the young man. Moreover, everything indicated that the great prince from time to time deliberately raised a ruckus in Bwangwana. According to the young man, the general reported that the prince had allegedly arrived in hair, but he did not go into details. The young master asked Yeon-hyung to look after Yoon-ha. He assured him that it was not difficult, especially for a friend. The comrade assured him that he himself was interested in learning about the former crown prince. Left alone, the young man looked at the picture with the poem that Yoon-ha had once drawn. Soon his clothes slid to the floor, revealing his young body. He remembered the words of the gentleman who hired his girlfriend. The young man began to paint pictures of his beloved spending time naked with that man alone. Physiology took its toll, and soon drops of semen splashed onto the picture. There was a basin of water and a cloth for a compress on the table. The girl was surprised that Yoon-ha had a high temperature, and she suddenly wanted to write a letter. Gari thought that she needed to get a good night's sleep for the medicine to take effect. The patient was surprised that she had been perfectly fine just recently. The maid angrily insisted that it was because Yoon-ha had been outside all day with a cold. Our heroine assured that she had never been sick before, so she didn't even notice. And getting ready to sleep a little, she asked to wake her up a little later. Gari covered her and asked her to quickly close her eyes. Reaching for the compress cloth, the girl muttered under her breath that she had been taking care of the patient all this time, and now she would have to watch over the sick woman all night. But then a man's shadow fell on her. The gentleman squatted down next to her. He was thoughtful and sad. Gari just wanted to address him and looked over her shoulder, but he gestured to keep quiet. Meanwhile, Yoon-ha was fast asleep, covered with a blanket, snoring. The sky changed from blue to even darker colors. Night was coming. There was a lantern hanging on the building. The former crown prince sat in his usual place in the pavilion and smoked. He wondered how a man who was capable of killing a tiger could become so weak. Recently he began to worry about that bastard, and he considered him a loser, that at such an age he had not yet passed the first stage of the exam. But here the privacy of His Highness was disturbed. The man bowed low. and expressed the hope that he had not caused inconvenience by visiting without warning. The guest said he was very sorry not to be able to see His Highness in Buengwana a few days ago. The blind prince expressed surprise that the civil and military officials who were supposed to protect Hansen had gathered there as if they were all waiting for him. Everyone thought he was blind and didn't pay much attention to his facial expressions. The visiting man recalled his surprise when the prince suddenly appeared, and he was not the only one whose face showed mute surprise. He assured that it was an amazing coincidence. The official assured that while His Highness was recovering in Hara, he would be his reliable friend and mentor. The man waved in front of the prince's face, making sure that he had not seen anything. Squinting his angry eyes, the guest concluded that, as expected, it looked like the prince really hadn't seen anything. And then he decided that since this was the case, there was no need to observe etiquette. Smiling, he assured that they could talk about everything, and he asked whether the rumor was true that His Highness had hired a reader. The guest assured that he had brought a very interesting book, and asked if the Cheongi-su could read it to them today. The master called Yul-jae and ordered her to bring the girl here. The young man stood dumbfounded, not knowing how to interpret such words. His Highness let go of the pipe, and it fell with a thud, and he commanded that if the Cheongi-su was still asleep, he should pour water on her to bring her to her senses. Rubbing his beard, he said that the Ben Makaldosa wanted to hear the voice of his reader. The winter night came into its own. A man was running quickly along the deserted street. He muttered that while he was waiting, he thought he would freeze. The advisor couldn't understand why no one had come yet. After all, the prince had ordered the reader to be brought, even if he had to be doused with water. Byong Machaldosa stopped. In the silence of the courtyard, he heard someone asking about the well-being of the Cheongi-su. The man hid and watched. The stately gentleman was talking to the maid. The girl was telling him that Yoon-ha was still feverish. Ga-ri thought that the young lady would need a few more days to recover. The nobleman asked about the orders. The girl admitted that the master had been some time ago, but he left, only looking at the sick woman for a moment. The man thought about it and called the maid to follow him. They quickly left. At that moment, Bayon Makaldosa came out from his hiding place. He giggled meanly. The man began to stealthily climb the steps to the door of the room. A question arose in his mind. Was there really a Cheongi-su there? The advisor thought about the fact that Shu Hong had not mentioned the girl's illness. He found it suspicious. The man carefully opened the door. A charming girl was sleeping in the room. She was quietly snoring. The observer immediately realized that the girl was in the room not as a Cheongi-su, but as a toy hidden from prying eyes. The man swallowed nervously. He admitted in a whisper that the girl was beautiful. Her skin was healthy and glowing, none of the usual dirty gray. A loud voice sounded nearby. The tall man approached the lurking advisor from behind. He expressed doubt as to whether this was true. The man with the sparse beard looked back. His mouth dropped open in surprise. The military officer recognized the man who approached as the crown prince. The young master expressed doubt at his words. He thought about it and remembered how Yoon-ha said that she was the ugliest person in the world. Bayon Machaldosa looked up at the young man. He did not agree with the statement about the girl's ugliness, and he insisted that such a statement was a blatant lie. The officer became increasingly heated and said that it would be difficult to find such a pretty girl like her, even if all the Kisang's houses were searched. The crown prince smiled silently at these words. The young interlocutor asked if the girl was really that beautiful. In response, he heard a lustful yes. The man admitted that the girl was so beautiful that he wanted to taste her immediately. The crown prince was surprised by the speeches. After all, he had ordered the Cheongi-su to be brought. However, she was ill, and she would hardly be able to read the book. The guest had already forgotten about the book. He assured his interlocutor that it was not necessary to read it. The enraged crown prince grabbed the man's head. The lord said that this only meant that from now on he would not be able to hear the voice of this child. Shu Hong pulled the scoundrel up the steps, holding him by the topknot. The advisor tried to break free and somehow ease his pain. The crown prince pushed the military officer away from him. The old man's eyes were filled with terror. The young master wondered if he should gouge out the advisor's eyes and cut out his tongue. Shu Hong walked up to the man lying down and continued his question. He asked if he should cut off the counselor's manhood and feed it to the dogs, since he dared to covet what belonged to another. In the winter night, scarlet blood splashed and flowed. The advisor screamed and tried to stop the crown prince. Yun-hee was tossing and turning on her bed. She was sleeping restlessly. In her half-consciousness, she imagined someone else's touches and embraces. Sometimes the young lady briefly came to her senses. Her gaze could not focus on anything, but she vaguely noticed the owner nearby. The girl could not understand what was happening. Someone picked her up. Yun-ha felt someone's strong embrace. The girl felt warm. She trustingly clung to the man's broad chest, remaining delirious. A soft splash of water could be heard in the bath. The crown prince descended into the bath with Yun-ha. The girl was unconscious. The man was thinking about the strange things. As soon as he remembered the sound of the young beauty's voice while reading and the scent of her body, his crazy thoughts instantly died down. The man began to gently touch the girl's face. He was thinking that if Yun-ha had been born into a noble family, they could have met in the palace much earlier. The gentleman could not believe that the young lady could not only read and write, but also knew a foreign language that was not easy to learn. He honestly admitted to himself that the more he looked at her, the more he desired her. Mr. Shu-hong recalled his old pet. He compared the girl to a fawn he raised when she was young. A quiet sigh tore the prince from his memories. The young beauty turned her head unconsciously and called him. The man froze, afraid to scare the girl. Yun-ha slowly came to her senses. She looked at the man in surprise and asked if she really saw Mr. Shu-hong. The owner did not answer. The girl began asking questions. She was interested in how the man had ended up there. The young lady was worried that someone might have seen him. The crown prince hugged the girl tighter. Light steam swirled in the bath and mixed with the warm light of the burning candles. The man did not take his eyes off Yun-ha. He asked who could see him. The girl blushed. She looked intently at her employer. Her mouth slightly opened. Breathing out the beauty's name, the man leaned towards her lips for a kiss. After a while, in the silence of the bathhouse, the gentleman asked if the girl loved him. Only the burning candles were silent witnesses of this conversation. The man asked if his embraces were so desirable that the young beauty thought about him even while shaking with fever. The gentleman began to insist on an immediate answer, squeezing her tightly. The girl was silent. She was completely in his power. In her delirium, Yun-ha saw next to her not the master who hired her, but her childhood friend. Therefore, she answered that it was not even right to say such a thing to the young master. Her cheeks were burning with a painful heat. The man asked who she wanted to merge with, and suggested that she think about him now. Steam rose from the water. Candles burned dimly. The hand held the girl tightly. Yun-ha mumbled something incoherent. Only then did His Highness realize that such a person actually existed. The girl saw everything that was happening as if in a fog, and she thought that it was a dream. After all, how else could one explain the fact that the young gentleman's face was in front of her now? When the man caressed Yun-ha, he assured her that these were the touches of the man from her dreams, and the breath was the one in whose arms she so desired to be. He kissed her, and at the same time took off his clothes. The beauty answered that she felt afraid and asked him to stop, but her partner wasn't sure it was fear. He insisted that his touch would make her feel better. Yun-ha felt like her body was going to explode. She told her partner that she could barely breathe, but it wasn't something unpleasant. The man said that she was so seductive. It was therefore not surprising that so many admirers were hovering around the beauty, and all sorts of rabble dared to desire what did not belong to them. Yun-ha said she felt a strange feeling inside. The partner reminded her of the agreement to tell the truth. The girl responded, "I like it, I like it." The partner reassured her that it was always hard at first. Goosebumps ran through our heroine's body. The gentleman announced that he alone should occupy her thoughts. He brought the beauty to the peak of pleasure with his caresses. Soon the former crown prince was holding an even weaker but beautiful girl in his arms, admiring her with rapture. The sound of the door opening echoed in the silence of the room. Yun-ha opened her eyes. She was in bed. Gari entered her room. The maid was glad that the young lady had come to her senses. She placed the tray with the bowl next to the girl, and told her that she had spent 5 whole days in bed. Yun-ha didn't believe it at first. Gari thought so. She insisted that the young lady did not remember anything, although she woke up from time to time. The maid asked how she was feeling. The girl replied that she was already fine. Suddenly, her gaze fell on the table next to her, and the various delicacies that were near her bed. Yun-ha wondered what it was. The maid admitted that this was the master's order. He ordered to prepare something to feed the girl when she woke up. Leaning forward sharply towards the young lady, Gari said that in fact, while the Chongisu was sick, the master was next to her both day and night. It turned out that the man not only gave medicine, but also carried the girl to the bathhouse to wash her. At these words, the young lady shuddered from the memories. The quiet words came to mind. The man said that the girl should know about his patience at that moment, even though he was burning with the desire to press his lips to hers. Yoon-ha couldn't believe that this was actually happening to her. She sat on the bed. Her hand nervously touched her face. The young lady tried to convince herself that it was a dream. Just a dream. Yoon-ha quietly muttered that even if she was dreaming, it was still extremely inappropriate and outrageous. The maid sat opposite the girl. She did not hear the quiet words and asked again what she had said. Yoon-ha assured that she had not said anything important. Changing the subject, the young lady asked how Ho-rim was doing. Was everything okay with him? Ga-ri was surprised that she remembered the guy, but she replied that the guard was fine and was now running around everywhere. Suddenly, the maid's eyes widened, and she remembered that she had almost forgotten something. She had something hidden under her apron. She handed the letter to the young lady. The girl asked what it was, and Ga-ri replied that some time ago a man introduced himself as the owner of a bookstore and handed her a letter. Eun-ha guessed that it was a juicy song, but why and for what reason he came, the girl did not understand. She began to read the letter and was very surprised. The man was sure that since she was in the private residence, she hardly knew what was happening. He asked not to be too surprised by the news. There were rumors that something had happened to Byulgam Cho Young-ho, who wanted to make Lee Yun his concubine, after which he became a eunuch. Hajusi Seong heard his wife causing a commotion last night. She was tirelessly pulling Gi Seng-yeon's hair. In the marketplace, young Master Yun was chasing a person who was heading somewhere. She had pulled her outer garment over her head to hide her face. The young man abruptly turned the girl towards him. She screamed in surprise. The robe slipped off her head. The young gentleman recognized the person. He did not even doubt her identity. In front of him stood Ki Sang-yeon. She was scared and confused. There were redness and scratches on her face. The girl was surprised by the young man. The young man asked about the injuries on her face. He clarified that it was the Belgium's wife who had done it. Ki-sun remained silent. The young master looked at Yoon-ha's sister intently. He turned around abruptly and ordered the girl to follow him. The door of the dwelling slammed behind them with a loud sound. The lamp softly illuminated the room. The girl turned to the young master. He had brought the Kisayang to his house. Lee Yan reminded him that if this was found out, he would be in trouble. She took off her outer garment, which helped to hide her face and hair. The young man asked if he looked like a person who would be easily hurt by rumors. He turned to the girl and said that Byulgam was a bastard and had 7 children and 5 concubines. The young master asked what his mother had told the girl. Had she threatened her? Perhaps she had said that they would no longer be interested in her in Bouillon, and so she would make her a concubine somewhere else. The girl listened to all the questions and asked the young master, because he was not worried about her, but about Yoon-ha. With her head down, the girl continued that after she found herself in this situation, her sister would do anything to earn more money. The young master agreed with her. He confessed that this was why his anger could not subside. Ki Sang-yeon stood there, shocked by his confession. The young man approached the girl and asked if it wasn't her fault that everything had turned out this way. His footsteps echoed loudly in the silence of the room. He began to blame the girl for not only failing to keep her sister by her side, but also for deciding to throw herself into the thick of things by becoming a Kisayang. The young gentleman grabbed the girl by the shoulders. He said that no matter how much the mother tried to persuade her to sell her body, she should have waited until he saved them both. Sister Yoon-ha admitted that Miss Hansu knows everything, so the young master should stop being so reckless. The girl did not allow the thought that a man of noble birth could admire a commoner. The young man squeezed her shoulders with force. Ki-sang continued to say that if he really cared about Yoon-ha, then the girl was asking him to forget about his feelings. The young master flared up. He ordered the girl to stop. The young man confessed that Yoon-ha had lived in his heart since his youth. Deciding that he wanted to make the girl his own, he taught her to read and write. He wanted her to be adopted by a noble family in the future. Holding Yoon-ha's sister tightly by the shoulders, the young man exhaled angrily that 10 years had passed since then. So let her not even dare to tell him about such things. Unshed tears froze in the big girlish eyes. He assured her that the girl looked exactly like her sister, and then he sank his lips into hers. Ki-sang cried silently until the young master let her go. Lee Yan replied that the master could continue to hate her just like now. She was used to it, because she had been faced with indignation and insults all her life. The girl realized that she was not good enough. But despite this, she wished with all her heart that Yoon HP would grow up to be a worthy girl. The young master was offering to take his sister's place. Since his feelings could cause trouble for the young beauty, Lee Yan could replace her sister and put up with the situation. The girl wanted to answer something, but the young gentleman took her hand and put it to his chest, and asked her to take off his clothes and prove her sincerity with her body. Then perhaps he could forget Yoon-ha.